Did you think we were done? So, over the last several weeks, I've been sharing with you all my rewrite for the Rise of the Sentinels visual novel. The goal of the rewrite was fairly simple, to take the basic framework of the story we got and try to mold it into something more cohesive and less controversial. However, as I was in the process of making this series, an epiphany hit me. The framework itself is precisely the problem. In the world of Runeterra, there are many antagonistic forces. Frankly, League has at least half a dozen potential apocalypses going on at any given moment. Even among these, however, the Shadow Isles has always been considered one of the biggest threats to the future of Runeterra, second only to the Void. I mean, an entire nation consisting of undead who want to murder every living thing in their path? Yeah, you can see why that would be a problem. The history of the Shadow Isles, both in canon and as a plot device in League, is long, and we're only going to be touching on the basics in this video essay. However, TB Skyn covers all that in great detail on his own analysis of the event, so I'd advise you all go check out that when we're done here, link in the description. 15 Retcon. The Shadow Isles have been a growing threat in League's narrative, and we've had more than one story in the past about various characters trying to deal with them. Riot's even gone out of their way to make a whole game about one such conflict, but at the time of this writing, that game isn't out yet. The point is, the Shadow Isles have a massive impact in League's lore, and there are a lot of characters tied to this whole storyline. The harrowing is something that the living in Runeterra have had to deal with many times in the past, but those who try to brave the Shadow Isles and strike at the heart of the Scourge never come back successful, if at all. And now, with Viego's introduction into the game, Riot saw fit to have the living face the biggest harrowing in Runeterra's history, one that spans the entire known world of Runeterra. This is huge. Imagine, the Black Mist attacking every corner of the map, ravaging entire cities, adding the lives it claims to the ceaseless tide of undead horrors. From the Freljord to Shurima, nowhere is truly safe, and characters with no prior connection to or even knowledge of the Shadow Isles find themselves facing an apocalyptic threat, rivaled only by the likes of eldritch horrors beyond the veil of reality. And then it concludes in like a week and absolutely nothing changes. This is the biggest problem with Rise of the Sentinels. This event could have been massive. It should have been massive. A global harrowing is something that should have had a massive, lasting impact on maybe not every character in the game, but it should at least be something that changes up the status quo for a good majority of them. The battle between light and darkness, the race to find the fragments of a dead queen's soul, all of this should have taken place over the course of in-universe months, not days. And then there's the format. To be honest, I like the visual novel approach they went for, but this should have been an actual visual novel, not just an in-client marketing scheme made purely to drive player engagement. There should have been branching story paths, more time spent in every region to see the effects of the harrowing, and so many more characters involved. On that note, let's start with the most obvious one, Rookie. Rookie was an interesting idea with an absolutely butchered execution. They tried really hard to mimic the style of the Spirit Blossoms for this, but that simply doesn't work in the context of the story they're telling. Rookie is meant to be a self-insert for the player, an avatar through which you get to interact with the Sentinels and the undead and play some part in this grand narrative that Riot is trying to tell. In actuality, though, Rookie is an utterly useless tag-along whose only plot significance is just taking the Sentinels from point A to point B. Yes, your role in the story amounts to being a glorified chauffeur. Now, they tried to give Rookie some significance in the story by establishing them as the talker of the group. In the visual novel, you're given various opportunities to overcome obstacles using nothing but words. Talking Olaf down from his berserker rage, coaxing a Noxian guard to open your cell, revealing the secret that gets you into the Black Rose territory, and bargaining with Graves, to name a few instances. It's a neat idea, since I think it would be a little too fanficky to just have you matching up to all these trained warriors and badasses throughout your journey. You are a rookie, after all. Still, the impact that this whole talker thing has is greatly diminished when your choices and actions really don't affect the story at all, save for some mild dialogue changes. There are some scenes where all of your dialogue options are flat out awful because the scene is written for you to fail, which kind of undermines the whole point. Hell, Rookie's final contribution against the Ruined King is to pick an insult to throw at him, and none of these insults are even really clever. What's more, there are moments in the original story where the Sentinels try to have sparring sessions with Rookie, but they don't amount to anything. You're never given a relic weapon, let alone an opportunity to use these techniques you've learned. These scenes literally just exist to give players another way of earning in-game points. If you're going to have Rookie be the talker of the group, commit to it. Like, imagine a whole scene where Rookie, has to maybe give like some inspirational speech or maybe even call out some of the other characters on their bullshit. It just it could have been so much more than what it was, and just having Rookie have a bigger impact on the cast would have been so much better than what we got. Speaking of the cast, well, we'll go more in depth about them later, but as a whole, that's one of the other major issues with Rise of the Sentinels. As I said before, this event could and should have included so many more characters, both those with pre-existing ties to the Isles and those who are dealing with the harrowing for the first time. Now, on the matter of the Sentinel and Ruin skins. Well, let's tackle the Sentinels first. As a whole, I think it's a neat concept. The Sentinels of Light, after centuries of fighting the darkness, have been worn down to a state where many of their outposts are abandoned and their numbers are thinning. As a result, Cinna and Lucian have to recruit basically whoever they can that's ready and willing to fight the Black Mist. You're effectively building an army of misfits and weirdos gathered from all over Runeterra to fight the apocalypse. It gives me major Red versus Blue or Guardians of the Galaxy vibes. If only it was executed better. I think the premise is held back primarily by the limitation of we can only have one Sentinel per region. And yeah, sure, I feel for the art team who'd have to design way more skins as a result of expanding the roster, but seriously. You go to every region on the map and only meet or interact with one or two characters from each area? What happened to building an army to fight the Ruined King? Then there's the matter of some of the recruits just not making any sense. On that note, let's talk about the Ruin characters. So, there's a lot of controversy around this whole idea. The Shadow Isles already had a diverse roster of undead antagonists for you to fight, and yet they get completely shafted from the story so that these alt skins can take their place? I absolutely agree that was a waste, and yet I actually love the idea itself. We'll get more into my thoughts on each individual Ruin champ later on, but the way that Viego's mind control works is actually a really cool concept. Basically, Viego can use the Black Mist to tap into all the darkness in someone's soul and bring it to the forefront. Your anger, your sorrow, your resentment, your anxieties, all of that takes over and you effectively become the worst version of yourself. This is a fantastic way to explore character development. Take Shyvana, for example. She's endured years of hatred and discrimination from Demacians because of her magical origins, and she keeps her anger in check because of her friendship with Jarvan and the Dragon Guard. What happens when that dam finally breaks? What happens when Shyvana has had enough and embraces the monster that Demacians believe her to be? Ruined Shyvana is an excellent introduction to what Viego's corrupting power can do to people. And it's really a shame that they don't use this to explore more characters' dark sides. But, again, we can go more in depth about them in the region breakdowns. Before we get there, though, let's discuss the prologue. As the introduction to the story, the prologue has the burden of establishing key details for the entire event. and it immediately drops the ball on several. First and foremost, your introduction, or rather that of Rookie, establishes a new Sentinel recruit left alone to guard the organization's headquarters. It's never really established what happened to the other Sentinels, nor why you alone remain. Furthermore, the fact that it establishes Rookie as a Sentinel recruit from the get-go implies that the character has already undergone at least some training with a relic weapon, which of course is undermined by the fact that Rookie has absolutely no role in any combat sequence throughout the narrative. There's also the fact that Rookie was apparently just given one of the most important MacGuffins in the entire story, which conveniently only works for the one specific person it's bonded to. In my version of the story, I had Rookie literally arriving on the island to find the Sentinel outpost abandoned, only to encounter Lucian and Senna shortly thereafter. I think if we're going to make a character like Rookie with no prior combat experience against the undead, then it makes more sense to say that they literally just got started and involved in this whole thing. Another issue with Rookie's inclusion in the story is that their choices, your choices, ultimately don't matter, like, we brought up before. The whole point of a visual novel format is to let players experience branching story paths based on the decisions they make. In my honest opinion, I do think this story would have been more interesting with alternate routes, even if it just boils down to a good ending and a non-canon bad ending. I mean, we know that multiple timelines exist in Runeterra, so why not use this as an opportunity to explore those alternate possibilities? If nothing else, it would help give Rookie some actual importance to the story, rather than just being the glorified chauffeur. On that note, let's address the Wayfinder. This random relic with the power to teleport between outposts is given zero explanation in the story. Why can only one person wield it? How exactly did the Sentinels learn to even make something like this, and why not make more? In my version of the story, I tried to justify its existence as being another fetter for Isolde's soul. The fact that a fragment of her resides within it would be all the justification you really need for why and how this particular relic is sentient enough to choose its own bearer. Of course, that also raises the question for why and how the Sentinels managed to put a piece of Isolde's soul into a relic, which itself would be a really cool concept to delve into once the Wayfinder's true nature is revealed. That said, I'm honestly not sure myself how I feel about its primary function. At the end of the day, the Wayfinder's just a MacGuffin used to justify how everyone can move around the map so quickly. Frankly, I think it would work better as a means of tracking down the locations of the fetters, which would better tie into its true nature and connection to the Hallowed Mist. Now, the Hallowed Mist is kind of a complicated topic in and of itself. It effectively acts as the opposite of Viego's Black Mist. While the Black Mist represents all the darkness in Viego's soul, the Hallowed Mist represents the light in Isolde's. That said, the only character we know of who can use the Hallowed Mist is Gwen, a doll animated by one of Isolde's soul fragments. Logically speaking, you would think this means that the other vessels, or fetters, would be capable of generating Hallowed Mist as well, including Senna, but I guess Gwen is the only one for some reason? To that end, the actual abilities of the Hallowed Mist are kinda vague. Like, we know what the Black Mist does. It can corrupt people and souls, as well as bind souls to physical matter in all sorts of nonsensical ways. Hecarim to his horse, scribes to their books, etc. As the opposite to that, it sort of makes sense that the Hallowed Mist could instill life into something that's not alive, and even give it human anatomy. Unfortunately, Gwen is the only example we have of this, so that really leaves a lot of room for creative liberties to be taken when it comes to expanding the Hallowed Mist's power. On the topic of Gwen, though, can we address her introduction to the story? She just appears on the island to meet up with Senna and Lucian with no prior explanation, something that admittedly even I struggled to justify in my rewrite. I think it would have been fine if she got some sort of short story before the event in which she finds out about the Sentinels of Light. But no, she just shows up. Honestly, I feel like it would have been better to have a segment of the story dedicated simply to finding and recruiting her. Perhaps Lucian and Senna hear about the Hallowed Mist, which they somehow already know about in the original story, and decide to look into its source. Speaking of Lucian and Senna, can we address their character arc? So, the story tries to give them all this relationship drama, which could honestly work very well if it were better written. Senna is obsessed with tracking down the fetters and stopping Viego because that's what the soul fragment inside her is telling her to do. And Lucian is fearful that she may get herself captured or killed again. The last thing he wants is to lose his wife after just getting her back. This could have been a fantastic topic to explore as the story goes on, if only it were ever properly addressed or resolved. Instead, you're forced to watch as they repeatedly make bad decisions over and over again through the narrative. Lucian tried to take Viego on himself and even makes a bargain with Thresh, the wraith that stole Senna's soul in the first place, just because he wants to keep her out of the action and out of danger. Senna, meanwhile, repeatedly orders the party to split up as you blindly hunt for the fetters under the assumption that doing so will give you some kind of edge. She doesn't have any sort of actual plan to beat Viego, aside from building a Sentinel army that barely even functions like an army. I mean, every time the party splits up, she insists that Lucian goes with someone else because it gives him an excuse to be paranoid, I guess. Frankly, one of the biggest issues with the story revolves around the primary MacGuffins themselves, the fetters. Okay, so let's recap. Viego's goal is to find the fragments of his queen's soul and reassemble her. This is a problem because he's willing to cover the world in black mist to do it. However, restoring Isolde herself is actually a good thing, as it turns out. See, unlike her husband, Isolde isn't insane and doesn't want the world to suffer. When Viego ultimately succeeds in the original story, his wife scolds him for his actions, telling him that she didn't want him to ruin the world for her and allows Akshan to scatter her soul again with the Absolver. So, what was the point of trying to stop Viego again? His quest was literally doomed to fail from the start because the person he's trying to bring back from the dead doesn't want to be brought back. We've seen this sort of trope done before, even as recently as Marvel's What If series and freaking Shang-Chi as well. But Isolde being on our side from the start really undermines all the effort you go through to stop Viego from getting the fetters. A completely meaningless effort since the Sentinels literally failed to acquire even a single one in the original story. Yeah, not only is there no real need to stop Isolde's revival, but the good guys literally can't do it anyways. The only reason you technically triumph at all is because Viego effectively lost before the battle even started. This is why, in my opinion, Viego's objective should have been different from the get-go. Instead of trying to resurrect his queen, he should have been trying to absorb her. Think about it. Viego is utterly obsessed with Isolde. She's his entire driving motivation, and yet we see time and again that he's acting against what she would want. Viego isn't driven by love. He's driven by an obsession. Even if you can make the argument that he did genuinely love her at one point, as the ruined king, all Viego wants is to take her soul back. The irony of this is that, as we see in his short story, Viego barely actually remembers Isolde. Her face, her voice, even her personality are nothing but blurs in his memory. Viego is a classic ghost story, a restless soul that refuses to move on until it's completed its objective, even if he's long since forgotten the reasons behind that objective. This is why I believe that Viego should be seeking to absorb Isolde's soul, rather than revive her. It takes his obsession to the extreme, in that he literally wants his wife to become one with him. Seeing her face, hearing her voice, none of that matters. Viego just wants to have her in any way that he can, because Isolde is no longer his queen or his wife. She is his prize. Having Viego absorb Isolde's soul would also give a justifiable excuse for his strength in the story. A common gripe people have is just how easily Viego overpowers the heroes time and again, even when he's dueling the likes of freaking Atreus on Targon's Peak. Now, power scaling is a controversial topic at the best of times, but Viego is simply way too overpowered in Rise of the Sentinels. However, if we were to assume that his power is growing with every soul fragment he absorbs, in turn allowing him to spread the black mist further with each one, well, that would give us an actual reason to want to collect the fetters before he does, now wouldn't it? On that note, let's discuss Viego's new lackey that helps him search for the fetters, Vex. I do not like her. I like the idea behind her, but she feels like a character who was rushed out just for the sake of this event, not unlike a certain Shuriman we'll get to later. To be honest, I could do a whole Runeterra rewrite episode just for Vex, but for now let's just focus on her role in the story. Origins aside, Vex really is a massive missed opportunity. It's implied that she has the power to instill others with negative emotions, or at least stoke what's already there. I'm not saying she should be the direct cause for every Ruin champ, but I think her main role in the story should be helping the Black Mist turn certain characters. Those caught by her shadow would succumb more easily to Viego's influence. Maybe not a necessary change, but then Vex isn't really a necessary character. At least this would give her some more impact, especially because the chapters where she does appear as an antagonist rob us of the chance to get a proper Ruined rep for the Freljord and Piltover/Zon. I could go on about Vex, but let's just shift gears here and discuss the progression of the story. In the original visual novel, you start in Demacia, then go to Freljord or Noxus, Ionia or Targon, Piltover and Zon, Ishtal or Bilgewater, Shurima, and finally the Shadow Isles. I believe that this order should be radically altered. For years, it's been an established fact that the Black Mist usually targets Bilgewater during the harrowing. This is because the Serpent Isles are the closest location in proximity to the Shadow Isles. As such, I believe that it would have been much better to start here, as Viego, having only acquired 2 soul fragments up to this point, still can't extend the Black Mist very far from the Shadow Isles. Also, doesn't it make more sense to start the story with the nation that has the most experience dealing with the harrowings? Now, keep in mind that at the time of this writing, once again, the Ruined King game isn't out yet. Regardless of whatever big reveals or events happen there, we're not going to consider them for this rewrite. Gee, maybe that game should have been allowed to come out. To that end, let's discuss the casting a bit, shall we? I think we're all in agreement that Ruined Fortune and Sentinel Pike were terrible decisions. The former makes a power bargain with Viego so she has the strength to bring Bilgewater under her control. Except that it's already under her control. Like, the last 7 or so years of lore have established Sarah Fortune's rise to power after dethroning Gangplank. We've literally had several stories and comics about her journey to eliminate the remnants of his legacy and take out rival gangs and bounty hunters. Why the hell does she suddenly need ghost powers to keep order in her city? What's more, doesn't that seem really out of character for her? Like, Sarah Fortune is ruthless to her enemies, but she's not a bad person, exactly. We've seen how she cares for her crewmates and tries to help the people of Bilgewater however she can, even directly fighting the Black Mist on several occasions. You mean to tell me that now she's willing to let the undead run rampant in her city and give control to Viego? That she's willing to turn her own crew into ghosts without their consent? Regardless of what happens in the Ruined King game, that just seems so out of character for her. If anyone should be making desperate power bargains, it's Gangplank. You know, the guy who lost everything in the Burning Tide story, the guy who's been skulking around in the shadows of Bilgewater trying to rebuild the remains of his pirate empire from what scraps remain. Come on, Ruined Gangplank would have been a much better choice. And there's so much cool stuff you could do with him. Have him raise the remnants of the Deadpool as a ghost ship. Let his sword burn with spectral fire and give him the ability to conjure explosive barrels from the Black Mist. This premise practically writes itself. Of course, one could argue that Ruined Gangplank might not be the best introduction to Viego's possession, since Gangplank's personality probably wouldn't actually change that much, and he willingly offers himself. That's why I believe we should have more Ruined characters per region, which is why I introduced to you Ruined Twisted Fate. Twisted Fate and Graves have had their stories intertwined for years. The two are ex-partners turned enemies turned partners again, and all of the recent stories and trailers involving them show them working together as a duo. That's why it completely baffles me, and everyone else, why Graves apparently just ditched Twisted Fate to go to Piltover alone when the Harrowing attacked. Because thinking that his partner ditched him was the entire reason Graves spent years hunting the gambler, until it was revealed to be a misunderstanding. Hell, Graves never even mentions Twisted Fate in the event, save for having one of Fate's cards in the game. In my version of the event, I had Twisted Fate mysteriously vanish at the start of the Harrowing, and so searching for him became Graves' primary motivation for joining the Sentinels. It certainly works a lot better than him just having some petty grudge against Vex, wouldn't you agree? Of course, it would have made even more sense if Fate were taken by the Harrowing, and Graves begrudgingly agrees to join the Sentinels in the hopes of getting his partner back. This would have made so much more sense than the random meetup and chase sequence in Piltover, and could have offered Graves more interesting dialogue than his random flirting with Vayne. As for who else could partake in this story? Well, I do agree that Misfortune should have played a role, but I think we can all agree that she'd make a much better Sentinel. Again, I don't know or care what happens in the Ruined King game that makes her suddenly want to submit to Viego. Sarah Fortune has always been against the Black Mist, and once willingly called a truce with Gangplank, the one man she hates more than anyone else, to stop it. She's even teamed up with Lucian before. She had all the makings of a Sentinel recruit, and frankly, making her ruined really does just feel like an excuse to subvert expectations. And also give her a sexier outfit, like that was needed at all. But you know who shouldn't have been a Sentinel? Pike. As much as I love the line, Rays are on the list, I'm sorry, no. Just no. Pike's single-minded obsession to hunt anyone that crops up on his list would make him even more of a liability than an asset on any team. Like a rabid dog you're barely keeping on a leash. Maybe they can find a justification for it in the Ruined King game, but that roster of heroes is somehow even more bizarre than this event's. And again, it should have been released before Rise of the Sentinels if there was supposed to be a justification for it there. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't think Pike should be ruined. While he is technically undead, he's being animated with the power of some sort of eldritch entity at the bottom of the ocean, supposedly acting as its assassin. Frankly, there's a lot about Pike that we don't know or understand. It's commonly believed that the entity controlling him is Nagakeboros, the same thing that supposedly turned Nautilus into a sea titan and gave Alawi her powers. We know that Nagakeboros and the undead have some sort of beef with each other, and the sea god's power can affect souls that has helped drive back the Black Mist before. I think if we're going to have Pike partake in this story, it should just be as himself, hunting down Rays or maybe even going after specific Ruined characters in Bilgewater like Gangplank, because his list tells him to. Honestly, there's a lot you could do with Pike and even Nautilus. How cool would it be if Pike showed up to hunt Ruined Twisted Fate, while Nautilus sought to drag the Deadpool back to the bottom of the sea? Alawi herself can summon like a billion spirit tendrils like she did in Shadow and Fortune, but this time it's not enough because Viego, and to that extent the Black Mist, are much stronger than they were then. The chapter could end with you having to leave Bilgewater, and trusting the Nagakeboros trio to handle things there as you set off in search of your next fetter. Now, you might have noticed that I glossed over a couple Bilgewater characters, namely Fizz, Tom Kench, and Nami, even though she's not technically part of Bilgewater, but Legend of Runeterra classifies her as such. Honestly, I don't think you need to include every character from every region in this story. It's fine to have some champions doing other stuff off-screen, but I feel like the conflict in each chapter should be big enough that multiple champions wind up getting involved, enough to give the story some lasting impact at the very least. Before we move on to the next region, let's establish something. The way relics are handled in this story is incredibly dumb. The fact that we just conveniently have Sentinel weapons perfectly suited to every recruit sitting in headquarters makes zero sense. Like, who was using the Sentinel half sword before Riven got it? Who made a bunch of tiny Sentinel blades that could only be controlled telekinetically for Aurelia? Honestly, I feel like we should have introduced a character whose job it is to make these weapons into the story. A Sentinel relic smith, if you would. I had Gwen fill the role in my version of the story because I wasn't sure how to properly introduce a character within the limited framework I was working under. But that still seems less contrived than these weapons just already existed. Putting that aside, let's move on to the next region on the list. Now, ending Bilgewater under the assumption that Viego got away with the fetter means that he could move the Black Mist on to either Ionia or Noxus next. Personally, I think Noxus would be a good place to go next, as it has the most potential to set up major story beats later down the line. First of all, let's start with the characters. I think Riven and Draven both work fine for the roles they were chosen to play. I personally love Ruin Draven as a concept because it shows that he's basically already the worst version of himself. If anything, I feel like they could and should have gone way harder with this. Make him even more arrogant, more full of himself. Also, the whole thing about him having extra axes on his belt, that was dumb. Just let him summon more axes from the Black Mist, there's no reason not to. As for Riven, well, Riven's kind of an interesting character. Her whole story arc is about finding redemption for her past. She's effectively a war criminal who was trained to fight for an expansionist empire that would do anything to conquer more lands, including the use of chemical weapons and child soldiers. Riven ultimately abandoned Noxus when she saw how far they were willing to go in Ionia, but the fact that she still spilled blood in their name is something that haunts her to this day. Now, Riven has a fair few stories to her name at this point, and her character arc is in a sort of interesting position. After going on trial in Ionia, she was allowed to stay and work on a farm, helping the people she wronged rebuild after the war. Unfortunately, this peaceful lifestyle was cut short when Noxus sent more soldiers after Riven to bring her back. Turns out, Noxus isn't super cool with soldiers who abandon the army out of sentiment. Also, LeBlanc maybe wants Riven's magic sword for some reason. But if that's the case, why did they let her have it back in the arena? Well, either way, Riven's story before Sentinels of Light left her stuck in Noxian fighting pits, forced to undergo struggle after struggle as a part of Dwaven's twisted blood sport. She even fought the man himself in one of the cinematics, but we never got to see the outcome of that fight. Given that she's still captured when the Sentinels find her, though, I think it's safe to say. Anyways, the point is that there are a lot of directions you could have taken Riven's story by that point. While making her a Sentinel probably wouldn't have been the one I would go with, I think it works well enough given the context of the situation. You help Riven escape the arena and offer her a place to go when she has no one else to turn to. Besides, I don't think it's out of character for her to want to fight against something that threatens the entire world, like the Black Mist. I don't think becoming a Sentinel long term is the best direction for her character, but for this event it works. Now, it's at this point that we have to address the overall setting. Noxus is a big place, with a lot of history behind it. What most know as an expansionist and military state is actually run in secret by what is effectively League's version of the Illuminati. Noxian politicians spend about as much time trying to kill each other as they do planning conquests. LeBlanc and the Black Rose have been dabbling in the dark arts for centuries, summoning demons, making blood zombies, and yes, even gathering relics from the Shadow Isles, all in an attempt to consolidate power. Honestly, I don't think it was a bad idea to have the Black Rose be the ones in possession of the fetter, especially if LeBlanc knows that its power is effective against the undead. See, LeBlanc's main rival in the lore may be Swain, but her real enemy is Mordekaiser. For those not in the know, Mordekaiser is a warlord who literally came back from death out of spite and spent centuries conquering the land of the living. The dude was basically unstoppable until one witch under his employ, LeBlanc obviously, stabbed him in the back and helped seal him back in the death realm. Unaware of the fact that this allowed Mordekaiser to make an army of ghosts in the afterlife and start plotting his revenge. Now, LeBlanc is basically searching for any means she can to deal with Mordekaiser if he ever comes back. Because, it's kind of hard to stop a guy who basically treats death like being sent back home. What I'm trying to say is that LeBlanc already has history with one undead tyrant, so I feel like Viego would be a matter of interest to her. The way I see it, there are a few ways you can play this. One is that LeBlanc decides to help the Sentinels, not necessarily joining them, but offering them some assistance. After all, if the Sentinels can beat back Viego and his army of the undead, maybe they'll prove useful pawns against Mordekaiser in the future. Alternatively, LeBlanc may offer her assistance to Viego, thinking that his control of the undead might rival Mordekaiser's, and that the two ghost tyrants could effectively just wipe each other out. I could go on, but there are a lot of ways you could handle the Black Rose in this event, and this whole essay is already going to be long enough. So let's move on and discuss LeBlanc's main political rival, Jericho Swain. Swain is also someone with ties to the dark arts, namely in that he has a demon, Raum, bound to his arm. Raum is a demon of secrets, meaning that it can basically let Swain spy on anyone just about anywhere. Pretty useful when you're going up against a shadow cabal whose influence spans an entire nation. That said, in this instance, I feel like Raum would be Swain's greatest liability. It's been confirmed by Riot that while the Black Mist can't really control demons, it does make them turn more feral and aggressive. As things stand, we know that Swain is able to keep Raum under control by using an undisclosed loophole in their contract. But what if that demon arm came into contact with the Black Mist? Rather than ruin Swain, this would give Riot an opportunity to show us a full-on, demon-possessed Swain, effectively letting Raum run wild within the Grand General's body. This dire situation would give rise to our next Sentinel recruit, Sentinel Darius. Now, in Viego's reveal trailer, we see Darius getting briefly possessed, which led to a lot of confusion as to why Draven was chosen to be Noxus's ruined rep instead. Truthfully, though, I don't feel like ruined Darius would be all that interesting. Unlike Draven, whose normal arrogance could be dialed up to 11, I feel like ruined Darius would just be Darius, but loyal to Viego instead of Noxus. Yeah, not much room to explore his character there. I feel like Sentinel Darius would be a more interesting direction to take things, particularly if he saw his brother and the Grand General were both being possessed. It would, of course, lead to a lot of group tensions with Riven, but it would also be interesting to see how he responds to Senna and Lucian's authority. Plus, seeing the married couple and having debates with Riven over Noxian ideology might stir memories of Quilletta, Draven's own former love interest. Speaking of whom, you know what this whole event is really missing? I sometimes give League's story flack for bringing people back from the dead more often than it kills them off. But if there's ever a time for that, it's during a freaking global harrowing. Imagine the Black Mist creeping into the final resting places of characters killed off in Champions' backstories, only to bring them back as vengeful ghosts. Imagine if Darius encountered Quilletta as a wraith in an Noxian graveyard or something. How would he react to that? How might her wraith respond to him? I know that this version of the story I'm telling already has a massive roster as is, but come on. You have the opportunity for champions to literally face the ghosts of their pasts. How do you not leap on this opportunity, Riot? Putting that aside, let's get back to talking about the actual champions that could be involved in this event. Let me ask you, how are we going to have a story about the Black Mist and Noxus without including Elise? While not technically undead, she still gets her powers from Vilemaw, a creature on the Shadow Isles. Hell, she's the reason why the Black Rose has been able to acquire relics from the Isles. Maybe she's even the one who got LeBlanc the Fetter. As for what her role would be, well, to be honest, I'm not super sure. Elise, while technically affiliated with the Black Rose, ultimately serves no one but herself. She worships Vilemaw because the so-called Spider God helps to keep her young and healthy, and the Black Rose supplies Elise with sacrifices for said god. I don't think she'd particularly care for Viego, but I don't see Elise helping the Sentinels much either. I think she'd work best as an independent party, perhaps luring people to her manor under the guise of keeping them safe from the undead, only to web them up for later? Something to think about. Another character who should absolutely have some degree of involvement is Vladimir, aka Viego's freaking uncle. Honestly, it would be such a treat to see these two interact beyond Viego's one-sided lines to Vlad in League and Legends of Runeterra. Considering that Vlad's family sold him off as a slave to a Darkin, I think he'd have some beef with the Ruined King. Can you imagine how cool it would be to watch a fight between them? Vlad bringing out an army of blood zombies to fight off Viego's legion of wraiths? That's just a metal album cover waiting to happen, and I am so disappointed we didn't get to see it. Speaking of blood zombies, let's talk about Scion. Now, as cool as it would be to see ruined Scion, I don't necessarily think that would work. Scion is animated through hemomancy. He's not a soul pulled back from the dead, but rather an empty corpse running on blood magic. In essence, he has nothing for Viego to corrupt, and I imagine that's probably why LeBlanc allowed his creation as well as that of the Grey Legion. They're undead soldiers, but they lack souls that can be controlled. Pretty useful if you're making contingency plans against someone like Mordekaiser. Frankly, I think it'd be more interesting to see Scion rampaging through the undead along with the rest of the Grey Legion, at least for as long as he can. Beyond that, the last character I'd like to see show up in Noxus is Samira. She, like Darius, was implied to have some kind of role in the event by showing up in Viego's reveal trailer, only to not appear at all when the event started. Beyond the fact that Sentinel Samira would just be a rad design, I feel like you wouldn't need to work too hard to justify her inclusion. Samira's a thrill seeker who loves taking on the most dangerous, life-threatening job she can find. Facing down an undead king and his legion of wraiths? Sounds like it'd be right up Samira's alley. Plus, her devil may care attitude could be fun to play around with in dire situations later on, let's be honest. There are still a few Noxian champions left, of course, but I feel like you could justifiably have Kled and the Dooku family out of it. I don't feel like any of them would have anything particularly worthwhile to add, unless maybe you want to use the Hairwing to explore what happened to General Dooku. That, however, I feel is a plot line better served for maybe some sort of Noxus event later on. I don't know. Before moving on, though, I do believe that this is the region in which we should start setting up for Mordekaiser later on. As established before, Mordekaiser is presently trapped within the Death Realm, and his armor is being held by the Black Rose. I believe that a massive harrowing going on could be the key to Mordekaiser's soul making its way back into the living world, where he starts making plans to storm the Immortal Bastion. We'll come back to Mord and his role in the story later on, but I think this would be the ideal point to start building him up for the finale. Hint, hint. Moving on, the next stop on our adventure should be the Freljord. Of every region, I think the Freljord has the most potential for the Black Mist. What do I mean? Well, let's start with addressing the fact that this region didn't even get a ruined rep in the original story. mainly because Vex served as the antagonist of the chapter. In my rewrite, I chose Tryndamere mainly because I just thought it would be awesome to have a battle of the Berserkers between him and Olaf. Speaking of whom, Olaf is an interesting case. Olaf is a character that can comfortably fit into just about any storyline because he's wandering the world looking for an enemy that can slay him. He's already fought against a harrowing once before in Bilgewater, so it's not like he has zero connection to the event either. It also helps that Olaf is a sort of comedic relief character, constantly wanting to die in battle, but he's unable to because of his berserker rage. It would add some much needed levity, although maybe we could do without the fart jokes he has in the original story. Beyond the berserkers, though, there is so much you could do with the Black Mist and the Freljord. For example, imagine Ruined Ash. Ash is a character with a lot of pent-up baggage. She's united several clans under her reign under the belief that she's the reincarnation/descendant of the legendary heroine Avarosa, when the truth of the matter is sketchy at best. Ash found a true ice bow in an unmarked grave at the top of a mountain, which may have belonged to Avarosa, though considering the fact that Avarosa died at the Howling Abyss, it's rather odd that her weapon would be at the top of a mountain. The point is, Ash is telling half-truths at best, but she's not doing it out of a desire for power. Ash genuinely wants to unite all of the warring tribes of the Freljord under a single banner, and she doesn't want to do it through conquest. She hates seeing her own people fight and slaughter each other just to survive, when they could be sharing resources and working together to overcome the tundra's harsh climate. She has built a prosperous kingdom, but the pressure of maintaining a peace built on stories that even she doesn't know the truth of weigh heavily on her. So imagine what the Black Mist could do to Ash. Imagine her being corrupted by Viego, being made to think that he has the power to unite the Freljord in her stead. All her troubles, all her worries, all her burdens. The ruined king can take them all away from her, and all Ash has to do is lend him her skill as an archer. If we're going to ruin Ash, though, I think it only makes sense to have her primary rival get a piece of the action. Sejuani leads the Winter's Claw, one of the biggest and most feared tribes in the Freljord. She firmly believes in the traditional ways of her people, that the only ones fit to survive in the Freljord are those strong enough to endure its harsh winters, and she sees the Avarosans as weak and cowardly. She even burned grains that were sent to her as a peace offering out of spite. Ash might be susceptible to the Black Mist, but Sejuani would never give in to Viego without a fight. Between the two of them, Sejuani is often considered the more villainous one, but that's exactly why seeing them in a sort of role reversal would be fun to explore. The trouble, of course, is whether or not you could justify Sejuani joining the Sentinels. After all, we did just establish that she doesn't care for outside help. Usually. Keep in mind that when times got desperate for her, she was ready and willing to call upon the aid of the Volibear, Freljord's freaking storm god, even if it meant risking her own humanity in the process. I think, if nothing else, she might be convinced to aid and even join the Sentinels, once they've proven themselves strong enough to fight back the horrors of the Black Mist. At least for a time. It should be easy enough to make a relic stone flail in place of her true ice one. The real question is whether or not Bristle would be initiated as well. That would be fun to explore. So, we've covered two of the major faction leaders in the Freljord now, but what about the third? Lysandra, Queen of the Frostguard, who presides over the eldritch horrors in the Howling Abyss. Now, Lysandra would be an interesting character to discuss in this event. She's generally considered an anti-villain of sorts, an antagonist for sure, but she's also keeping the monsters of the void sleeping under a massive veil of true ice. The trouble is that she takes to using some rather immoral methods to do so, and it doesn't help that she's also pretty nihilistic. Lysandra believes that the world is doomed, that the void cannot be stopped, only delayed. That's what she's been doing for millennia, trying to buy the world as much time as possible, never bothering to seek an actual solution to the problem because she genuinely believes there isn't one. She captures people and freezes them into the true ice barrier so that their energy can effectively act as fodder to keep the spell going a little longer. When the barrier was formed, she even froze her own sisters, Avarosa and Cerilda, to keep the monsters at bay. In my opinion, Lysandra shouldn't be a ruined character or a sentinel. Ultimately, I don't think the Black Mist would even really affect or concern her that much, unless it were to creep into the Howling Abyss and raise her victims as wraiths. Imagine Lysandra having to contend with the vengeful spirits of her sisters, as well as everyone else she's murdered to keep the barrier intact. There are a lot of different directions you could take that story, but one thing I think should definitely happen is Lysandra getting the fetter and trying to use a souled soul to strengthen the ice barrier. The Sentinels would have to fight her for it, leading to an ironic battle between two groups trying to fend off two different apocalypses. That would be fun. And you know who should be taking part in that battle? Braum. I don't think anyone's going to contest me when I say that Braum should absolutely become a Sentinel. I mean, he's one of the playable characters in the Ruined King game, so evidently this wouldn't be his first encounter with the Black Mist. It really is straightforward, I think. Just give the man a relic stone shield and you're good to go. I guess you can make the argument for Ruin Braum, but honestly, I don't see it. His character is so deeply rooted in being heroic and virtuous that I literally can't even imagine how you'd try to put a dark spin on his personality. He's called the Heart of the Freljord for a reason, after all. So yes, Sentinel Braum, get on it. And after all of that, we've barely even scratched the surface of what you could do with the Freljord. I mean, how would the Black Mist affect the local demigods? Volibear already seems to have a somewhat fragmented personality as is, and Ornn, well, he just wants to be left alone, so I don't think he'd take too kindly to the undead on his doorstep. Of course, I don't mean to say that Ornn should be a sentinel, that would just be way too overpowered. But I think if nothing else, you could do something with him to craft or improve relic weapons, or just have him be the one that keeps ruined Volibear in check, I don't know. There's no way the heroes will be able to deal with that on their own. As for Anivia, well, a phoenix constantly cycling between life and death, who even knows what the Black Mist would do to her? I could go on, talking about how this event might affect Nunu, Udyr, or even freaking Gnar, but I think you get the point by now. There is so much to do with the Black Mist and the Freljord, and we've only hit the tip of the iceberg, appropriately enough. For now, however, let's head south a bit and discuss how things are going down in Demacia. Now, while it may not be the most important region to the overall story, I feel like the harrowing should have the biggest impact on Demacia out of any region. Presently, Demacia is in the midst of a civil war. It's a nation founded on a rather misguided fear of magic, and anything arcane is frowned upon there. Magical creatures, enchanted weapons, people born with a natural affinity for spellcasting, all things to be locked up or cast out. They build their structures out of petricite, a special stone that they think nullifies magic, when really petricite just absorbs magic, and it has limits to how much it can absorb. As we see, those petricite walls aren't nearly enough to stop the harrowing. Frankly, the undead don't care at all. They ravage Demacia's streets and make a mockery of its knights. Hell, freaking Hecarim is supposedly running amok somewhere in Demacia at the start of this whole event, according to his short story anyway. Before all this began, Demacia was in the middle of a mage rebellion led by Silas, made of those magically gifted folk who are rightly sick and tired of being persecuted just for being born different. Then, all of a sudden, boom. Both sides are now confronted by a legion of the undead that readily kill any living thing in their path, magic or not. I imagine that would put a damper on the whole Civil War thing. In fact, it may wind up forcing a unity. Think about it. The Black Mist is running amok in Demacia, and the people realize that their petricite walls can't protect them. Then, during all the chaos, the mages in Demacia band together to create small safe havens, using their collective magics to keep the black mist at bay in localized areas. Some, mostly the common folk, flock to the mages out of desperation. Others, namely the nobility, try to pin this all as a ploy. The black mist must be the mages' doing, and they're only offering shelter to people in an effort to make themselves look good. This story should have huge ramifications on Demacia's future, and we haven't even discussed the character roster yet. Let's start with Shyvana. As established earlier on, I think she's a fantastic choice for getting ruined. Shyvana has been weirdly absent from the whole Mage Rebellion storyline and occupies a rather awkward spot in the lore because of it. She's loyal to the crown, but also has to watch people like her getting locked up or worse. I do really love the line she has about accepting her role as a monster, and the fact that she chooses to stay in dragon form most of the time after getting ruined is a great touch. Hell, even the whole debate you have with Vayne about whether to kill or spare her had a lot of potential. More of that, please. I imagine you could spend a whole arc in Demacia just trying to deal with this undead dragon, and the members of your party that you've recruited up until now would have varying feelings about whether someone like Shyvana is worth trying to save, or if she's too big of a threat. In the visual novel, you're asked for your own thoughts on the matter, but of course it doesn't really matter because the story follows a linear path. Imagine if you actually had a say in whether or not to spare Shyvana in this chapter. Yes, I know, champions have plot armor and Riot isn't willing to actually kill off anyone who's playable in League. But that's why you have alternative timelines, you cowards. Moving on, one of the characters who abdicates for Shyvana's death is, of course, Vayne. Vayne was a great choice for a Sentinel. She already hunts monsters for a living, and frankly, I think her addition to the story was one of the better decisions made by Riot in this event, even if the execution could have been handled better. Vayne is effectively League of Legends Batman, but willing to kill. She even struck down her own mentor once she learned that Faye was a werewolf, because her hatred of black magic runs that deep. We'll touch more on this later on, but the original story ends with Vayne going back to re-establish the Sentinel base in Demacia. I love this. It's one of the few instances we have of the status quo changing after the event, even if we're probably not going to see anything come from it for a long, long time. Vayne is a loner, someone who doesn't readily work alongside others unless she has to. The fact that she's willing to start training and recruiting Sentinels after the harrowing implies at least some level of growth for her character, and I'd love to see how she handles taking on the mentor role, especially given what happened to her own teacher. But, for the time being, I think it's more than enough to just have her begrudgingly work with the Sentinels because her silver bolts barely affect the undead. So, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another character who also occupies a rather awkward spot in Demacia. Lux. Lux is a light mage, as well as a member of a powerful noble family. Only a handful of people know about her power, and those who do work to help her conceal it from the mage seekers. Lux is a very positive, optimistic character. She wants to help liberate the mages, but doesn't agree with Silas's approach of starting a violent revolution. She tries to hide her light magic from the general masses, but is shown to readily and willingly use it when the situation is dire. I think an invasion of the undead would qualify. So, the immediate question to ask is, should Lux become a Sentinel? From a character standpoint, it makes sense. Not only would she readily step up in defense of her homeland, she's basically a living relic stone, and a powerful one at that. Honestly, it would probably feel kind of redundant designing a Sentinel skin for her. I guess you could replace her usual wand with a relic one, but again, I'm not sure if there's much point in doing that. I think one way to solve the issue is having Lux accompany the Sentinels through Demacia, but she ultimately decides to stay there and help keep her countrymen safe rather than setting out to face the ruined king. That will be a job for the actual Sentinels. Of course, Viego isn't the only threat Demacia would have to contend with, nor the only king. Yes, it's time that we talk about Jarvan IV and his role in the story. Now, there are a few ways you can approach him in this event, but I do think that J4 should be an antagonist. After all, the Mage Rebellion allegedly killed his father, Jarvan III, and since then J4 has gotten even stricter on hunting mages. That hatred and anger he feels is a prime target for the Black Mist to exploit. I imagine that as the mages are creating safe havens against the Black Mist, Jarvan can go around tearing them down out of hatred and distrust. We know that he's taken to heeding the counsel of nobles like Tiana Crownguard, who, as established earlier, would probably paint the Harrowing as the mage's doing to begin with. Don't misunderstand me though. I don't think that J4 should be ruined, at least not at first. What I think should happen is that Jarvan is personally leading armed assaults on the safe havens with his elite warriors, under the pretense that doing so will lead him to the source of the Black Mist. Eventually, the Sentinels would have to defend one of these safe havens from Jarvan, only for the fight to be interrupted by Shyvana's sudden appearance. Seeing his friend twisted in such a manner, and still believing the mages to be the cause, finally pushed Jarvan over the edge. First, the rebellion takes his father, then turns one of his dearest friends against him. The mages must pay. After a brief confrontation with ruined Jarvan, the Sentinels ultimately manage to subdue him. I think that's when Garen and Xin Zhao should arrive on the scene, looking to offer their king reinforcements, only to find him corrupted by dark magic. Now, Garen also has an inherent distrust of mages, but he also more or less knows his sister is one and turns a blind eye to it. I think if Lux were to talk to him and explain the Harrowing is the result of the Ruined King and not the Mage Rebellion, he might be willing to listen. Ultimately, I think Garen and Xin Zhao should agree to take their own king into custody and watch over him, intent on keeping Jarvan's transformation hidden from the public and nobles. After all, if word got out that the monarch of Demacia himself had been affected by dark magic, then his position as a king would end up compromised. Of course, while Demacia is known to have plenty of scheming and corrupt nobles, not all of them are quite so wicked. Enter Fiora Laurent, a woman who seized control of her house because she refused to simply be married off as a political pawn. Under her command, the Laurent family has become one dedicated to mastering and perfecting the art of swordsmanship, silencing many of their detractors through customary duels. I think Fiora would make for a great Sentinel recruit. Unlike most Demacians, she doesn't seem to hold any real bias against mages, as her only real concern is protecting her family name and honor. Hell, one of Fiora's relatives, Maeve, became a Sentinel in Legends of Runeterra. I think Fiora joining in this event would be a great way to set that up later on. One hero inspiring another, as it were. Speaking of heroes, Poppy is yet another character teased for the event that never actually showed up. She, like Samira and Darius, were shown in Viego's reveal trailer. Poppy was fighting alongside Vayne in that trailer, and Sentinel Vayne even has in-game lines acknowledging this. I'd have loved to see Poppy working with the Sentinels to help save Demacia, maybe even hoping that the hero might be someone among your group. That being said, I don't think Poppy should actually wind up becoming a Sentinel. Like Lux, I believe it'd make more sense for her to remain in Demacia by the end of the story, helping where she can to drive the Black Mist back while searching for the fabled hero supposedly destined to wield her hammer. Still oblivious to the fact that it's her. Of course, if we're talking about protectors, then obviously we have to bring up Galio. Now, Galio is kind of weird. He's a Petrocyte Colossus who comes to life after absorbing enough magic, made to help defend Demacia from mages. No one knows how he's able to become animate, not even Galio himself, and a lot of Demacians don't even know he can, since it happens so rarely. That said, I imagine harrowing in Demacia would be more than enough to wake Galio up and keep him awake for a good while. All that necromantic power is bound to stir the Colossus, and I don't think Galio would be negatively impacted by it, since we've seen him absorb dark magics before. Perhaps Galio could even be the one who shows up to subdue ruined Shyvana at the end. You can't tell me it wouldn't be cool to see a Colossus fighting a dragon. Also, he's friends with Lux and also kind of Poppy, so that would be neat to see. On that note, I think that cements Demasia's cast pretty well. Silas, Sona, Quinn, Kale, and Morgana can all safely be assumed to be off doing their own thing. Lux, Poppy, and Galio would remain in Demacia to help fend off the Black Mist, while Garen and Xin try to keep their own ruined king under control and hidden from the public eye. Before we move on to the next region, however, there is one more character I'd like to discuss. Before the Rise of the Sentinels event, we got a couple of short stories pertaining to some of the Shadow Isles champions, I guess sort of as a compensation for the fact that they wouldn't show up in the event proper. Most notably, Hecarim, featured in the Despoiler of Havenfall. It's nothing too grand, just the Shadow of War slaughtering an entire port town. That's all. Jokes aside, it's really not a bad read, even if it is pretty dark. I won't spoil it if you have an interest in reading the story yourself, but the important thing to note is that Hecarim was last seen causing chaos in Demacia. So I think it only makes sense that he should appear in some form during this chapter. Even if it's just as simple as Hecarim being the one to claim the fetter and take it back to Viego, a scene dedicated to the Sentinels fighting the Iron Order could have been really rad if done properly. Maybe you can even have him hunt Rookie like he does Jonath in the story. Next on our list is what I believe to be the most botched region in the entire event. Ionia is a land that resides on the boundary between Runeterra's physical realm and its spiritual realm. They are perhaps the most well-equipped nation to deal with a harrowing, and we know that they have in the past. I mean, Ionia is an island nation where the land itself can come to life and drive off invaders. The plants, the rocks, animals, even the weather and surrounding ocean are vaguely sentient. In essence, I don't think the Black Mist should be able to ravage Ionia as easily as other nations. Between the spirit of Ionia and the Kinku Order working to drive back the darkness, I'd like the journey through Ionia to be relatively peaceful. At first, anyway. I think the undead should primarily be an issue along the shoreline, but have difficulty making it further inland until, well, we'll get there. Firstly, though, let's discuss perhaps one of the most controversial characters in this whole event, Ruined Karma. I do not like this decision, and most fans I've talked to are in agreement. Karma is supposed to be the enlightened one, the living embodiment of Ionia's will. She's like Zelda or the Avatar, a soul reincarnated hundreds of times over to serve as a leader and defender for her people. Having attained inner peace is literally her entire thing, so there shouldn't even be any discourse in her soul for Viego to take advantage of. Sure enough, even her portrayal in the story is kind of half-assed. Ruined Karma just rambles about Viego being the true enlightened one, whatever that means, and effectively gives in to him for no reason. I did think it was kind of cool how Karma could fight his control and occasionally switch back to her normal self for a brief time, but the fact that she could be corrupted at all was ridiculous. If anything, Karma should fill a similar role to Alawi or Lux, not becoming a Sentinel, but using the power she already has at her disposal to help fight back the Black Mist. One character who does fit the role of a Sentinel slightly better is Aurelia, though I honestly have mixed feelings about her. Aurelia is effectively the leader of a resistance movement trying to drive out the Noxian occupational forces from Ionia. She's a war hero, having bested Swain at the Battle of Placidium and basically turned the tides of the original Noxian invasion. The one thing she wants above all else is to keep her homeland safe from outsiders. So yes, she would absolutely have beef with Viego. My issues with Aurelia joining the Sentinels are twofold. Firstly, that she's effectively abandoning her people with no explanation to do it. And two, I'm not really sure her powers should work with Relic Stone. Honestly, Aurelia's magic is a little vague in how it works. She can control blades by dancing, and the specific blades she uses are pieces of her family's crest. It's implied that her power requires a deep personal tie to the weapons, as well as the spirit of Ionia itself. So I'm honestly not sure if it makes sense to just replace them. Personally, if we're going to make Aurelia a Sentinel, I think it would have made more sense to have her blades embedded into Relic Stone. They could be removed later, of course, but I don't think it makes sense for Aurelia to just give up her normal blades considering what they represent to her. Also, maybe have her actually address her followers before just bailing on them like she did in the original story. Like, she never has a point where she, goes to her resistance and says, "Hey, I'm going with these total strangers to fight the undead. Hold down the fort while I'm gone." Like, unlike the Kinku Order, the people of Navori don't seem quite as well prepared to deal with the crisis on their own. So, just up and leaving like that, not the best decision. Speaking of the Kinku, might I ask an obvious question? Where the hell is Shin? The whole point of the Eye of Twilight is that he is supposed to be the one who keeps balance between the spirit realm and the physical realm. You mean to tell me that the black mist raising and corrupting souls from the dead wouldn't upset that balance? Now, I've discussed the matter with a friend of mine, and while I stand in the camp for Sentinel Shen, I've heard some fair arguments for Ruin Shen as well. After all, one of the requirements of the Eye of Twilight is being detached from emotion, stifling your own feelings so that you can make fair and impartial judgments for the sake of the balance. Shin is pretty good at that, for the most part, but we've seen his armor crack a bit whenever he has to deal with the likes of Zed or Jin. The past is a sore spot for Shin, and that could very well be exploited by the Black Mist. I think the best direction to go here would to have this be impacted by player choice. Depending on the decision you make, you can either save Shin from succumbing to the Black Mist and recruit him as a Sentinel, or watch him become ruined and be consumed with a desire for vengeance. The latter, of course, would likely lead him to hunting down Zed. Now, Zed would be an interesting case to tackle in this story. He and his order use shadow magic, a dark art not too dissimilar to necromancy. The difference is that shadow magic is implied to have closer ties to demons, but it's still capable of corrupting people who aren't mentally trained to handle it. Zed, as it turns out, is mentally trained to handle it. He studied the forbidden arts and formed the Order of Shadow to oppose foreign invaders like the Noxians. In short, his group is a more extreme version of Aurelia's movement and a complete opposite to Shen's order, forsaking tradition and acting with extreme prejudice. Zed is cold and ruthless, but he ultimately acts for what he believes to be the betterment of Ionia as a whole. I think it would be safe to assume he's vehemently opposed to the Ruined King, though whether or not the Black Mist could affect him, well, that's tricky. Zed certainly has a lot of pent-up negativity, which is only stoked by shadow magic. However, as stated before, we know he can control it. In the comics, we see him fighting Master Kusho, who became a beast of living shadow by the end. Kusho undeniably had more power, but Zed's mastery and technique over shadow magic ultimately allowed him to outmaneuver and outplay his former mentor. Really, I think the argument could go either way. Perhaps a ruined Zed would believe Viego the only one strong enough to protect Ionia? Of course, there's also the possibility of him becoming an ally. We know, thanks to Senna, that it's possible to use dark magic while wielding relic weapons. The only question is whether Zed would be willing to entertain the idea. There's a lot to unpack with Zed and the role he could play in the story, which is why I chalk him up to another possible enemy or recruit depending on player choice. Maybe you're allowed to recruit one ninja master but the other gets ruined? Food for thought. Since we've talked a lot about Zed and Shen, let's move on to the third member of their rivalry, Jin. Kata Jin is a serial killer, a madman who likes to make art out of corpses. He's been a thorn in the ninja's side for years, and while he currently works for a secret cabal that wants Ionia to develop hex-tech weaponry, Jin ultimately serves no one but himself. He's cold, calculating, and utterly obsessed with the beauty of death. So, what would Jin think about undeath? What would he think about his art being defiled by the black mist? Oh yes, we're going there. Sentinel Jin. Obviously, he'd have a lot of friction with the other members of the group, especially if you recruited Shin or Zed. Everyone would constantly have to keep an eye on him to make sure he doesn't try to pull anything. It could have the same sort of vibes as Sentinel Pike, but at the very least, I think Jin works better for the role in that he at least has the capacity to understand the situation. He'd be constantly forcing himself to refrain from attacking the Sentinels, at least until Viego is dealt with. And the question of if/when he finally snaps is ever present. Although, you could make the argument that Jin should just be kept out of the story altogether, and that's fine. I'm really just spitballing ideas here. One character who absolutely should be included, however, is Lilia. In my original rewrite, I had her getting ruined, and I stand by that decision. In the canon visual novel, Ruined Karma has a line about the beauty and purity of Viego's love for Isolde, despite the obviously toxic feelings he now harbors. I think it would make much more sense if someone like Lilia were to be enamored with Viego instead. Lilia is supposed to be the guardian of dreams, and she's on a quest to restore good dreams to a land haunted by the aftermath of a long and very destructive war. She's shy and a little bit naive, but Lilia is willing to step out of her comfort zone for the sake of her duty. So imagine how she could be seduced by memories and sweet dreams of how bright and happy Viego's life was with Isolde by his side. She wouldn't necessarily even be evil as much as she is heavily misguided, making for an interesting contrast with the other Ruin characters. And you know who else I think should have been turned by the Black Mist? Yone. Now, what I'm about to say might be a bit controversial to fans of the current Yone, but hear me out. I don't think Yone should have been brought back the way he did. There's this whole vague mystery around how he got revived through demon magic, and even Yone himself doesn't really understand what happened to him or how that works. His entire quest right now is literally just to figure himself out by hunting other demons. What's more, Yone's revival really messed with Yasuo's entire character arc. Yasuo is, or rather was, the Unforgiven, hunted down for years on the false accusation of killing his own master. He and Yone fought to the death over this very misunderstanding, with Yasuo of course emerging the victor. Now, that whole misunderstanding was cleared in Riven's trial, and Yasuo was forgiven by his village, but he still had to carry the weight of having killed his own brother. And then Yone comes along and tells Yasuo that he doesn't care anymore because he's trying to figure out all this demon nonsense. Yasuo then randomly decides to leave Ionia and go to Bilgewater as a ham-fisted excuse to put him into the Ruined King game. Again, I know that game may have like a better justification for it, but it still feels rather forced. Here's what I think should have happened. Yone gets resurrected by the Black Mist when it comes to Ionia and transformed into a powerful wraith on par with other undead champions, like Thresh or Hecarim. Rather than dismissing his own death entirely, he becomes obsessed with the mission he had just before it happened, hunting down his traitor's brother, Yasuo, who of course he wouldn't know has been absolved of the crime on account of, being dead. This would serve as a much better way to naturally integrate Yasuo into the story, at least in my opinion. Maybe even have him join the Sentinels purely to deal with his brother's wraith. As far as characters for this chapter go, we've barely scratched the surface. Ionia has a grand total of 21 affiliated champions. So yes, there's a whole lot more we could talk about. However, there are two more characters that I want to make a brief cameo. The Mist Catchers from Legends of Runeterra, Tech and Kana. Their overall role in the story could vary from minor to major, but I'd like them to show up merely as a way to show that not every Sentinel outpost is abandoned. I know there's another pair of Sentinels who fills that role later on, but, well, we'll get to them. I think Tech and Kana work better for it, though, since Ionia is naturally more resistant to harrowings in the first place. As for the chapter itself, I think Ionia is perfect for the slow burn kind of story. As I said before, the land's natural spirit magic could work to keep the Black Mist at bay, meaning that your initial search through Ionia would be relatively calm compared to the other chapters. Aside from maybe the coasts, much of the land remains peaceful, and yet an ominous sense of dread lingers throughout the entire chapter. Eventually, the calm shatters, and Ionia's peace is destroyed as the Black Mist corrupts the very spirit of the land itself, perhaps through Viego's direct intervention or some other method. Ultimately, we leave the First Lands knowing that perhaps the one place that could have been a true safe haven from Viego's reach has now succumbed, just like all the other nations you've seen so far, setting the stage for what's to come next. Alright, I think we'll end it off there for now, since this video has already gone on for well over an hour. I'll be uploading part 2 in the coming week or so, so until then, please try to be patient and look forward to it.